Sir, if you sign that, you're authorizing a shell company to take control of every pipeline from here to South Dakota. No one in the room understood what just happened, not because the sentence was too complex, but because it came from someone no one even noticed. He stood quietly against the wall, dressed in a navy blue janitor's uniform, still holding his mop. His name was Calvin Reed, the man who had cleaned the 45th floor for the past 3 years. And not once had anyone bothered to ask, "Who are you?" But today, he wasn't here to clean the floor. He was here to warn the entire room about a multi-billion-dollar fraud. And within seconds of those words leaving his mouth, the room exploded. Not with understanding, but with shock, confusion, and then fury.
Who do you think you are? You're just a janitor. Get him out of here!
A high-level board meeting, filled with custom-tailored suits and million-dollar decisions, was suddenly thrown into chaos. All because of a man they'd all overlooked. But what they didn't know was this Calvin wasn't just any janitor. He was once a national-level risk compliance analyst, and what he found, buried deep in a forgotten printout left on a copier, might be enough to save the United States from the largest resource manipulation scheme in modern history. Can you imagine? A man who was treated like a shadow becomes the only one bold enough to speak the truth. And not just speak it, but drag an entire system, kicking and screaming, into the light. Stick around until the end, because this isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call about justice, courage, and why sometimes silence is apt. The man at the head of the conference table shot to his feet. His eyes, sharp and cold, sliced across the room like silent daggers. Kyle Graham, CEO of Westman Energy, wasn't used to being interrupted, and especially not by a janitor. Security. Get him out. Now. But Calvin didn't move. He stood tall, hand resting calmly on the mop handle, like he had just said the simplest truth in the world. "I'm not here to cause trouble, sir," he said, his voice steady, but the clause on page 37, section C, states that operational control can be reassigned under emergency provision without review. That means whoever owns that shell company owns your future. For a brief moment, the room stopped breathing. Then, a sharp laugh broke the silence from the right side of the table. Are we really letting the janitor interpret our contracts now? The sarcasm belonged to Mitchell Banks, head of legal affairs. The same man who'd once bragged on live television. "Every single word in this deal has been vetted by the best legal team in the country." Calvin slowly turned toward him. His eyes locked on Mitchell's, unblinking. "I didn't read it because I wanted to," he said. "I read it because none of you did." From the far end of the table, partially obscured behind a projection screen, a young woman stood up slowly. "Wait. He's right." Her voice was clear. Certain. Her eyes lit up like she'd just recognized something she'd buried months ago. Her name was Lila Brooks, a junior legal assistant hired just a few months earlier. "Section C is dangerously vague," she said. "I flagged it once, but it was dismissed. I thought maybe I misunderstood. But now." She turned toward Calvin. "He said exactly what I was afraid to." Kyle Graham slammed his hand against the table. "Enough. This is a closed-door meeting. That man has no authority to be here." But Calvin cut him off, calmly, but firmly. "Sir, I was once the head of risk compliance for Petrocorp's Midwest. I know exactly what clauses like this can do when pipelines fail, and everyone starts pointing fingers. I lost everything for speaking up the first time. I won't stay quiet again." Lila blinked, surprised. You worked for Petrocorp's." Calvin gave a slight nod. 5 years. Until I raised a red flag on a clause just like this one. They ignored it. 3 months later, we were in federal court. 2 people died. Because no one could act fast enough. Because no one had the authority to find. The room was still. Kyle Graham's anger had shifted into something else now. Something murkier. A mix of caution and fear. But still, his pride held him back. He looked Calvin dead in the eye. "Even if you're right, this isn't your place." Calvin took a deep breath. He looked around the room. At the suits, the titles, the polished shoes. At the same people who'd walked past him every morning, without a single glance. Then he said, simply, "Maybe not. But it's yours. And if none of you say something now, then who will?" The room slowed, quieted. A room built on billions, fortified by decades of power, now stood on the edge of a decision. Listen to the invisible man. Or keep pretending he doesn't exist. The meeting was adjourned. Not because Calvin raised his voice. Not because anyone slammed the table or walked out. But because no one had the courage to speak after what he said. Layla stepped out of the boardroom beside Calvin. The long hallway of the 45th floor stretched into the soft amber light of late afternoon. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then finally, she broke the silence. You really used to work at Petrocorp's. Calvin nodded, eyes fixed on the floor he had scrubbed down to its bones. I used to sit at tables like that, right in the same spots I now mop behind. Lila bit her lip. I had doubts about that clause too. But Mitchell told me not to overcomplicate things. Said, leave that part to the senior team. Calvin let out a faint chuckle. It wasn't bitter. Just tired. They always say that. Until everything falls apart, and the person closest to the truth is the one nobody listens to. Lila turned to him. So what now? You planning to walk away? Calvin shook his head. Not this time. She nodded, then said something he didn't expect. Then let's do this together. She handed him a small USB drive. I saved every contract draft on here. Even the first version, before legal revised it. Some of the clauses don't match the final copy. I'm not sure what it means, but I need you to take a look. Calvin took the drive, and in that moment, his eyes flickered with something rare hope. Not because of the evidence, but because after all these years, someone finally believed him. That night, in a cramped apartment in South Denver, Calvin sat at his kitchen table, hunched over an aging laptop. The USB drive glinted in his fingers, small and silent, but heavy as a grenade. He opened each draft, scrolled line by line through the clauses, and then, he stopped. Appendix C Clause 12. In the original draft it read, all control transfers must be reviewed and ratified by the board under full vote. But in the final version, that line was gone. Replaced with, control transfers may proceed under emergency alignment protocol, without requirement of full board consent. Calvin leaned back in his chair. They had changed it. Quietly. Intentionally. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. He exhaled slowly. Then walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out an old notebook. Its spine was torn. The cover faded, but inside, his handwriting was still clear. Petrocorp's. The day everything collapsed. He set the USB down beside it, and started to write again. The first page read, Westmont. The day we spoke up. The next morning Calvin arrived earlier than usual. He walked down the familiar corridor of the maintenance level, still pushing his cleaning cart, but this time, his eyes no longer looked wary, they were alert, sharp, focused, because after last night he knew, he was invisible no more. On his way in, he noticed something odd. The utility door, usually left open during early hours, was locked shut. A laminated notice was taped to the front, restricted access, system maintenance in progress. Calvin narrowed his eyes. System maintenance. On a Thursday, that never happened. It was an unspoken rule for the past 3 years. A familiar instinct stirred, not fear, but the survival reflex of someone who'd once been sacrificed to protect others. He didn't push forward. Didn't confront. Instead, he turned on his heel and took a different hallway, heading straight to the 38th floor. To Lila's office. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Lila was packing up her things. She turned when she saw him. Calvin, she whispered, eyes flashing a quiet urgency. We're being watched. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. This morning, she continued, my computer was reset. Emails gone. And someone went through my desk. I know because I always leave my dark blue pen on the top right corner. Today it was off. Way off. Calvin nodded. Maintenance wing is locked down. They're cleaning their tracks. Lila bit her lip. I think Mitchell found out we have the original contract draft. A pause stretched between them, then he said, we need a copy off-site, now. Lila nodded. She reached into her bag, pulled out a fresh USB, and plugged it into her personal laptop. I'll transfer everything here, encrypt it, and send it to Veronica. Calvin frowned. Veronica who? Investigative journalist. She covered the Montana pipeline blowout. One of the few who actually believes in what she writes. Can she be trusted? Lila looked at him, gaze steady. She was threatened with a lawsuit by this very company. And still didn't take the article down. If anyone has the guts to bring this to light, it's her. Calvin paused a beat, then nodded. Okay, but once you send it we go dark. Where to? Somewhere with no cameras, no names. Off the grid for now. Lila gave a small chuckle. First time in my life I feel like the villain in a spy movie. Calvin smirked. No kid. Villains never carry the truth. She hit send. The file was encrypted and routed through 3 layers of protection. 1 copy to Veronica. 1 backed up in a secure cloud with a password only they knew. 1 printed on paper. Calvin folded the documents and tucked them into the inner pocket of his worn-out coat. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. "Let's move," he said. No one was chasing them. Not yet. But they both knew. The shadows had started to shift. That morning, while millions were sharing Veronica Clay's article and praising the brave janitor, a black, unmarked car pulled up in front of Westmont Energy's main headquarters. 3 men stepped out. They didn't say a word. No introductions, no badges. But the way they walked straight into the elevator, the way security guards silently stepped aside, said more than enough. Behind the doors of the 45th floor boardroom, Kyle Graham sat still, arms crossed, face unreadable. On the table, a printed copy of the article lay open. The bold headlines burned like fire. "The clause that could sell America." Former compliance officer turned janitor, Calvin Reed, uncovers a buried amendment that bypasses board consent. One of the 3 men sat across from Kyle and placed a thick file on the table. "You said this was under control," the man said, slowly. Kyle didn't answer right away. Then he looked up, voice dry. "He's just one man, a failure looking for attention." The man tilted his head slightly. "The problem is, now everyone's listening." Meanwhile, in a run-down motel near the western hills of Denver, Calvin was checking the windows. Every one was sealed with black duct tape and cloth, except for a small slit just wide enough to let in light. Leila sat at the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on her phone. She was watching a live interview between Veronica Clay and a human rights attorney. That janitor didn't just uncover a contract flaw, the lawyer said on air. He unintentionally exposed an entire web of interests, where financial firms manipulate national resources like they're items on a supermarket shelf. Lila turned to Calvin. "Do you think they're coming for us?" Calvin didn't respond immediately. He sat across from her, his gaze still as steady as ever. "You know what's more dangerous than a direct threat?" he asked. Layla shook her head. "Silence," he said. "When the powerful say nothing, do nothing, react to nothing. That's when you know they're not preparing to respond. They're preparing to erase." Alila swallowed hard. "So what do we do next?" Calvin pulled out an old photocopy, an aged audit report from his time at Petrocorps. Each line of text, every number, every faded signature spoke of something buried long ago. "We thought this started at Westmont," he said. "But it didn't. This goes back further. Before you were even born. And the people truly behind this, they're still in the shadows." Lila furrowed her brows. "You mean someone higher up?" Calvin nodded. "Not just higher, systemic." A ding echoed from her phone. A message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. One of you is already compromised." Her lips trembled as she read it. Calvin locked eyes with her. "We can't stay here." She nodded. They stood, packed what little they had. Outside, the sun had risen high in the sky, but in their eyes, only shadows closing in. The next morning, Calvin and Lila left the motel right after receiving the anonymous message. They traveled by local bus, switching lines 3 times, then walked a long stretch through rows of bare trees on the outskirts of Boulder. Neither of them said much, only the wind and their hurried footsteps filled the silence. Finally, they stopped in front of a small brick house, covered in patches of moss. The roof sagged to one side, the wooden door was weathered, and the front bell had long been removed. Lila hesitated. "Are you sure he'll help us?" Calvin nodded. "He's the only person who once dared to do what I did and paid 3 times the price." He knocked on the door. 3 knocks, slow, then quick, then slow again. After a moment, the door creaked open. An older man with a slightly hunched back and unruly silver hair appeared. His eyes widened when he saw Calvin, then softened into a quiet smile. "Calvin Reed, I thought you disappeared." Calvin gave a small nod. "Almost did. But there are still things unfinished." The man opened the door wider. "My name's Harlan Duke," he said to Leila. "I used to be an investigative journalist, until they pulled my credentials for publishing a map that showed illegal pipeline routes on indigenous land." Leila shook his hand, her eyes lighting up. She'd heard about that story, how it got buried shockingly fast by mainstream media. The 3 of them sat in an old kitchen. Harlan poured them tea without asking many questions. Calvin laid out the printed drafts, the annotated notes Lila had preserved. Harlan studied them, squinting at the pages. "Mitchell Banks," he muttered, flipping through. "Who's to work at Coldstone Holdings? He's the same guy who rewrote a key contract in the 2012 pipeline deal. I could never find hard proof back then. But this." He paused, running a hand along the paper's edge, as if holding something fragile. "This could bring down the whole structure." Calvin spoke quietly, almost as if he didn't believe what he was saying himself. We need to release it. Not just a story, the full documentation. Public, encrypted, impossible to take down. Harlan nodded. I've got an underground network. People who've been silenced before. Professors, lawyers, former congressmen, even engineers who used to work inside Westmont. They all have reasons to speak. They just need someone to lead. Lila looked up. Are you sure they still have the courage? Harlan gave a dry chuckle. Courage, maybe not. But silence has already cost them too much. He stood up and stepped into the next room. When he returned, he carried an old laptop wrapped in black duct tape. This machine doesn't connect to the internet, but it holds everything I've gathered over the last 15 years. He placed it gently on the table. If we do this, we have to move fast. Because once this data's out, the people upstairs won't just want to shut us up. They'll want to wipe us out entirely. And we were the evidence. Calvin looked at Layla. She nodded, without hesitation. Harlan opened the laptop. Lines of encrypted data filled the screen. There was no turning back, no space left for fear. Only one road remained. To bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. Harlan typed the final lines of code. Inside the battered old laptop sat over 3,000 pages of documents. Revised contracts, leaked emails, underground infrastructure maps, internal meeting logs, suppressed legal files, and sworn testimonies from employees who had walked away in silence. We just need 3 minutes, he said, eyes locked on the screen. 3 minutes to send all this data to 127 secure endpoints. Journalists, activists, civil organizations. A simultaneous release. Every package encrypted, scheduled for public drop in 6 hours. No one can stop it. Lila stood by the window, staring out at the backyard. The rain hadn't stopped, but she could feel another storm coming. Not from the sky but from people. Calvin poured a cup of tea. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze was calm. It's time, he said. Harlan hit enter. The screen faded to black. White letters appeared, payload initiated, 0300s. The countdown began. Each second seemed to squeeze the air tighter inside the room. 2 minutes, 14 seconds. Layla's phone buzzed. Unknown number. One message. Stop now. She swallowed hard. Didn't respond. 1 minute, 02 seconds. The porch light flickered. Calvin stepped to the window. A black SUV had pulled up in front of the gate. 3 men in suits stepped out. No rush. No words, but their eyes cold as steel. 30 seconds. They're here? Calvin whispered. Do we lock the door? Layla asked, half joking. Harlan shook his head calm. No need. We've got time. 10 seconds. A knock at the door. Firm. Authoritative. Open up. You're in possession of unauthorized federal documents. No one moved. 3 seconds. Last warning. Harlan smiled. There's nothing left to warn about. 0 seconds. The laptop screen lit up. Transmission complete. A small flicker of light passed through Calvin's eyes. Not pride. Not victory. Just relief. Because the truth was finally free. Outside, the door burst open. The first man stormed in, shouting, "Turn off the device! Now!" Harlan didn't flinch. Too late. Leela raised her hands. No resistance. Calvin stood firm, eyes locked on the intruder. You can take me, he said, but you can't take back what's already been seen. 2 hours later, the hashtag #FakeLaws37 was trending #1 on Twitter. CBS interrupted programming with breaking news. CNN, BBC, Politico, all launched special bulletins. Photos of Calvin, standing in front of a dusty photocopier in his janitor's uniform, flashed across screens around the world. The media gave him a name, the Watchman, the last one to be noticed, yet the first to truly see. Leela was detained. Harlan sat silent behind bars. And Calvin said nothing. But his story said everything. And the world could no longer pretend it hadn't seen. 3 days after the leak, America was split in two. One half was furious. Protests erupted in front of Westmont Energy's headquarters. Student groups, climate activists, even former oil industry employees, now stood together chanting, "Silence is no longer an option. Clause 37 killed our trust." The other half was skeptical. Fake news. Sabotage campaign. Janitor. With more financial knowledge than an entire legal team. They whispered to each other. No way a regular man could have pulled this off. Someone must be behind him. And in the middle of it all was Calvin. Sitting alone in a windowless white room inside a federal security facility in New Mexico. He wasn't tortured. He wasn't beaten. They simply made him feel like nothing. For 48 hours he was kept in isolation. No clock, no voice, no mirror, just cold fluorescent lights and the endless hum of a ceiling fan. Then one afternoon, the door opened. A man walked in, gray suit, round glasses, More legal consultant than interrogator. He pulled up a chair across from Calvin, placed a black leather file on the table and opened it. Mr. Calvin Reed. Born November 20th, 1968. Former Regional Risk Officer, Midwest Division, Petrocorps. Terminated in 2011. Since then, no records, no activity. Until last month, Calvin said nothing. The man continued. You understand the scale of damage this leak could cause, not just to Westmont, but to the financial markets, to trust in the system, and potentially to the national economy. Calvin smirked. If an economy needs lies to survive, maybe it deserves to collapse. The man studied him, then slid a sheet of paper across the table. We don't want to take this to court. No headlines, no spotlight. All you have to do is sign this, acknowledging the documents were altered, and that you misunderstood the situation. And in return, Calvin asked, you walk free. We'll give you a new home, a new identity. Go anywhere you like. No one will follow. Calvin stayed still. And Layla. She'll be dealt with separately. Cooperate, and we'll go easy on her. He looked down at the paper. Bold black letters stared back. Voluntary statement of inaccuracy regarding all related documents. Calvin placed his hand on the table. Firm. But calm. No, the man didn't flinch. He seemed prepared for it. You're turning down your only way out. Calvin looked up, eyes suddenly bright. No longer wary. This isn't the first time I've lost everything, but this time I'm not losing my honor. A long silence. The man slowly closed the file. Pity, he said quietly. He stood, walked to the door. Left without another word. The door shut behind him. Calvin leaned back in his chair. Let out a slow breath. Not out of fear, but because he knew from here on, every path leads to pain, but this path was the one he chose. And this time, he wasn't turning back. 3 days after Calvin refused to sign the denial statement, a video suddenly appeared online. No edits, no music, just a single raw shot of a young woman, face slightly swollen, eyes tired but unwavering. Leila Brooks. She sat inside a detention room. The wall behind her was cracked. A dim overhead bulb cast light over her tangled hair. She looked straight into the camera. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. If you're watching this, I may no longer be free, but the truth still is. Calvin Reed is not a radical. He's the only one who saw what the rest of us chose to ignore. He didn't expose the truth to be famous. He did it because he refused to die without leaving a voice behind. I was part of that system. I stayed silent. I believed that silence would keep me safe. But that silence was the slow death of my conscience. So I choose to speak, even just once. Because he taught me, truth doesn't need to be believed to exist, it just needs to be seen. The video ended with her looking directly into the lens. No tears, no goodbye. Just a gaze so fierce the world couldn't look away. 4 hours later, thousands flooded the streets of New York, Chicago, Seattle, Atlanta. New chants rose. Let the truth speak. Free Leila. Free Calvin. On television, former senators began to speak out. Civil rights attorneys filed motions for federal witness protection. Independent investigations were announced by several state prosecutors. Meanwhile, inside Calvin's holding facility, a young guard entered his room. No papers, no handcuffs. He simply said, someone asked to see you, and you have a choice. Calvin was led to a brighter room. Waiting for him was someone he never expected to see again. Veronica Clay. She smiled gently and slid a printed copy of the latest New York Times across the table. On the front page, a photo of Calvin and Layla. The headline in bold, the last two who refused to bow. Veronica spoke softly. Your story's outgrown me, Calvin. It's no longer an article. It's a spark. Calvin looked at the image. Layla was holding his hand amid a sea of protesters. A photo digitally combined from 2 moments. And yet, completely true. We're getting you out. Veronica continued. Not through the back door, but through justice. Calvin gave a slow nod. No need for fanfare, he murmured. Veronica smiled. You might not, but an entire generation does. At Likar, the Supreme Court agreed to review the case. Harlan was released, accompanied by a growing list of witnesses. Layla was transferred to a secure location under federal protection. Calvin still hadn't appeared in public, but his story had already become legend. A janitor, once forgotten, who brought an empire to its knees. Not through power, but through the quiet resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, except the truth.